Thank you very much, and thanks to you all for your hospitality here. It's my first time to Utah Valley University, where my friend Matt Holland is the president. And what a marvelous place this is. What a marvelous, spectacular view we have out here, isn't it? Andy mentioned I taught at the Air Force Academy for a couple of years, and I thought that was the best view in America on a college campus, but I might have to revise my opinion now. So thank you again very much for your hospitality. I'm very gratified to be here. I had a very slight acquaintance with Justice Scalia, so it's a great honor to be here. I'm not going to talk much about him because I don't know his jurisprudence nearly as well as my fellow panelists or the rest of your speakers today. But I am going to talk about and have sort of a conversation with you, I hope, about constitutional interpretation and the founders. So we're going to be taking a look in the rearview mirror, to use Professor Amar's phrase, if you heard him say that this morning. By the way, what an impassioned talk that was from him about sort of justifying what we call American exceptionalism. And that's a term that's very controversial today. But one thing it does mean is that our constitutional regime is exceptional. It's the exception to the rule. We're unique. And so it was just a delight to hear him. I did think if he would learn to talk a little faster, maybe he could cover more ground. But at any rate, I'm quite privileged to be following him in the order. So let me begin with a quotation for you. Whatever veneration might be entertained for the body of men who formed our Constitution, the sense of that body could never be regarded as the guide in expounding the Constitution. As the instrument came from them, it was nothing more than a dead letter. Close quote. Now, who do you think said that? A sitting Supreme Court justice today, a critic of Justice Scalia's alleged originalism, a proponent of the living Constitution. Justice Scalia was on record saying, I think incautiously, that he believed in a dead Constitution. So who do you think would say something like what I just read to you? Well, it might surprise you to learn that it was the father of the Constitution, James Madison, the namesake of the foundation that employs me. It might also surprise you, it did surprise me, to learn that Madison himself believed in a sort of living Constitution, though not one living in the sense that its proponents today tend to speak of a living Constitution. So I'll give you a little fuller quotation, which comes from a speech on the Jay Treaty that Madison gave in the House of Representatives in the Congress in April of 1796. So here's Madison again, speaking as a congressman. Whatever veneration might be entertained for the body of men who formed our Constitution, the sense of that body, and he means the Constitutional Convention, could never be regarded as the oracular guide in expounding the Constitution. As the instrument came from them, it was nothing more than the draft of a plan, nothing but a dead letter, until life and validity were breathed into it by the voice of the people, speaking through the several state conventions. If we were to look, therefore, for the meaning of the instrument beyond the face of the instrument, he means the words on the paper, we must look for it not in the general, which is to say the Constitutional Convention, but in the state conventions, which accepted and ratified the Constitution, closed quote. So what was the context of this speech? It was only 8 years removed from the ratification of the Constitution. It was during the second Washington administration. George Washington is still president, and the controversy swirling around that Jay Treaty. So if you know anything about the so-called Jay Treaty, it was very, very controversial. In fact, John Jay said when he came back to the United States after negotiating that treaty, that he could have traveled the whole length of the eastern seaboard at night, lit only by the fires of his own effigy being burned. So he really, really took a lot of heat for this treaty. So it's a very controversial thing. But one of the controversies surrounding that treaty was constitutional interpretation. Madison had been a close, though informal, advisor to President Washington, and he begun to see his erstwhile friend Alexander Hamilton. We're going to hear more from Professor Staub, evidently, about Hamilton. Madison lived to see Hamilton's expansive interpretation of the Constitution, dominating the Washington administration. Madison opposed not only the terms of that Jay Treaty, which he thought too pro-British, but the Senate's sole right to ratify it because of the appropriations language in the Constitution. And you recall that the House of Representatives, it's reserved to the House of Representatives to originate money bills and things. So right away, right at the beginning of our history, we see this controversy about how to interpret the Constitution. So I want to attend then, in the little time I have with you, to James Madison's theory of interpretation of the Constitution. We call him the father of the Constitution, and we call him that for good reason. What was his theory in this little speech? Well, he calls the unratified Constitution, remember, a dead letter. A dead letter. And he denies that a proper gloss on its meaning can come from the convention notes, even his notes. You know, he took the most detailed and what have become the most authoritative account of that constitutional convention. Even that is not to be looked toward, he says. The gloss must come, if come it must, from the notes of the state ratifying conventions. And this belief of Madison's is sometimes given as a reason that he delayed publishing his detailed notes of the convention during his lifetime. And let's also acknowledge that Madison did indeed believe in a living constitution. A living constitution of sorts, I ought to say. For what is a constitution that has life, his word, but a living constitution? It had been a dead letter. It was enlivened by the ratification of the people speaking through their state ratifying conventions. And so far, I think that's pretty clear. But then this question is begged, at least it's begged for us, those of us who live right now and don't and look ahead, as Professor Amar said, right? Look at the road ahead of us by looking in the rearview mirror. We have to, I think, work out what sources beyond merely the state ratifying conventions might be appropriate for us to understand the meaning of the Constitution. What about other contemporary writings of the times? What about, say, the Federalist Papers, as we call them? And Justice Scalia loved to cite the Federalist Papers. What about the Anti-Federalist essays, those people who were opposed to the Constitution? Are they proper Madisonian sources for modern-day constitutional commentators, or even Supreme Court justices? Strictly speaking, at least from this speech, it would seem the answer is no to that. Those essays did not enliven and validate the Constitution or give it legitimacy, as Madison says. But can't they help us to understand how the words in the Constitution were understood at the time by the ratifiers and ultimately by the people, which Madison says are the only legitimate meaning? Fortunately, the father of the Constitution left a few more guideposts to his theory of constitutional interpretation, though they weren't discovered until the mid-20th century. I think in the 1940s these came to light. In his so-called Detached Memoranda of about 1819 or so, Madison wrote, quote, "If the meaning of the Constitution was to be looked for elsewhere than in the instrument, it was not in the General Convention, that is, the Constitutional Convention, but the state conventions. The latter were the authoritative bodies which made it a law, or rather, through which the nation made it its own act. It is the sense of the nation, therefore, not the sense of the Philadelphia Convention that is to be consulted. And that sense, if not taken from the act itself, is to be taken from the proceedings of the state conventions and other public indications," he says, "other public indications, as the true keys to the sense of the nation." Close quote. Again, this is from something that historians call the Detached Memoranda. These were sort of notes that Madison made to himself about his career, looking back retrospectively over it. So Madison here explicitly adds that phrase, other public indications. He broadens the field beyond the state ratifying conventions as guides to the original meaning the nation gave to the Constitution. Also, he never suggests that meaning should be sought outside the text of the Constitution. There is always that hypothetical if that he puts in there. Grammarians call this the subjunctive tense, right? And I might add that his Federalist co-author, Alexander Hamilton, focused every bit as much on the meaning of the Constitutional Convention. The meaning given to the Constitution by the ratifiers, not the convention, which is to say by the nation, versus the convention, versus the framers of the Constitution. He likewise downplayed the intentions of the Philadelphia Convention when he wrote, this is Alexander Hamilton again, quote, "Whatever may have been the intention of the framers of a constitution, that intention is to be sought for in the instrument itself, that is, in the law itself, in the Constitution itself, according to the usual and established rules of construction. Arguments drawn from extrinsic circumstances regarding the intention of the Philadelphia Convention must be rejected," Hamilton said. So there you have Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, the principal two defenders of the Constitution in the Federalist Papers, saying, no, it's not our work in that in that constitutional convention that should drive interpretation of the Constitution. The Madisonian motherlode, however, comes in a letter he wrote in 1824 to a man named Henry Lee IV of the famous Lee family of Virginia. I think Henry Lee IV was the half-brother of Robert E. Lee, the great Civil War general. It's the best statement because, unlike the detached memoranda I just read to you, which were sort of private musings, Madison anticipated that this letter to Henry Lee would likely become public. He had retired from his own tumultuous presidency. Remember what happened when Madison was president? The U.S. Capitol is burnt. The White House is burnt. He was thinking about the legacy, his own legacy, the legacy of the founding era. That year, 1824, Lafayette came from Europe and visited Madison at Montpelier. So this triggers recollections of his. And he's thinking about party disputes, right? He had helped to form one of the principal political parties, the first, I think, genuine national political party in American history. And he wanted the Constitution that he had helped to father to be, as he put it, justly interpreted. This is his phrase, justly interpreted. So he wrote to Lee the following. This is a long quotation, but I'm going to read the whole thing to you. "The Constitution itself," he said, "must be an unfailing source of party distinctions." So the Constitution itself is going to cause clashes. People are going to fight in different parties over it, over its legacy, over its meaning. But there is nevertheless sufficient scope for combating the spirit of party, and particularly to give to the Constitution that just construction, which may put an end to the more dangerous schisms otherwise growing out of it. With a view to this last object, what's that object? A just construction of the Constitution. He says, "I entirely concur in the propriety of resorting to the sense in which the Constitution was accepted and ratified by the nation. In that sense alone, it is the legitimate Constitution. And if that be not the guide in expounding it, there can be no security for a consistent and stable more than for a faithful exercise of its powers." So let's just stop for a moment. The only just construction, the only stable construction, the only secure construction is the one that was given to it by the nation when it was ratified. If the meaning of the text be sought in the changeable meaning of the words composing it, it is evident that the shape and attributes of the government must partake of the changes to which the words and phrases of all living languages are constantly subject, he says. So all languages, words change their meaning. But if we constantly change the shape, change the meaning of the constitutional words, then the shape of the government is going to change. It will be insecure. It will be unstable. Okay? What a metamorphosis, he says. What a metamorphosis would be produced in the codes of law if all its ancient phraseology were to be taken in its modern sense. And that the language of our Constitution is already undergoing interpretations unknown to its founders will, I believe, appear to all unbiased inquirers into the history of its origin and adoption. Not to look farther for an example, take the word consolidate in the address of the convention prefixed to the Constitution. You all recall, I hope, when the Constitution came out of the Philadelphia Convention, it was sent to all of the states under a letter signed by George Washington saying, now, we did this sort of behind closed doors, now it's time for you to address this in public. Have a big open debate about it. Fight about it in the newspapers and call state conventions and vote it up or down. So Madison says what a metamorphosis would be produced, and he says also let's take a look at one metamorphosis that's already happened. This word consolidate. In that letter that George Washington sent out, he says, it there and then, this is Madison, it there and then meant to give strength and solidity to the union of the states. In its current and controversial application, it means a destruction of the states by transfusing their powers into the government of the union, closed quote. So here's Madison saying, already, here's one word that's changed its meaning. And if we were to read the Constitution that way, we cannot have a stable form of government. We can't have a secure form of government. Now, I hardly need, I think, to interpret this quotation I just read from Madison. He's crystal clear here. I repeat, in that sense alone, he says, it is the legitimate Constitution, closed quote. So a non-originalist, and sometimes Justice Scalia was called an originalist. He himself preferred the term textualist, especially a fair meaning textualist. But a non-originalist or a non-fair meaning textualist reading of the Constitution is illegitimate, according to the father of the Constitution. And he says, or at least implies, that it would be unjust. Any other kind of interpretation will result in a change in form of the government. That's what a metamorphosis is, right? We say something morphs from one thing into another thing. It changes its shape. It would be a metamorphosis. And Madison, that's not a good word for Madison when he's talking about the Constitution. You don't want it to morph into something else. And it will undermine the stability of the government. And though he says it elsewhere, in his report on the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1800, which I'm not going to read to you, but we might refer to in the Q&A if we have time, Madison believes that it will result in a change, get this, from a republic to a monarchy, by inevitably transferring state power, transfusing it, he said, into the national government. The national government will swallow up the states, he says. That would be an awful metamorphosis. Now, I think I'm about to the end of my 15 minutes, so I'm just going to try to sum up here just what Madison had said. There are other things that I could cite. That report in 1800 on the Alien and Sedition Acts, again, very, very controversial, which Madison opposed. I could cite from his correspondence in 1821, but his hierarchy of authority, this is one thing that really drives Madison's interpretation of the Constitution. You heard Professor Amar talk about that phrase, we the people, and glory in it, right? We the people, in a sense, wrote that Constitution, but more importantly, we the people ratified it. That's what gave it life in Madison's terms, right? And Madison, had a hierarchy of authority. The people are always on top. This is a regime of popular sovereignty. That's why that Constitution begins, we the people. It doesn't begin we the states, does it? It says we the people. People, and then Constitution, and then government. So the people are always the ultimate source of authority in our regime. And his related principle of interpretation is consistent with that, I think, that hierarchy. It led Madison to privilege the interpretation of the text of the Constitution given to it by the people. Sometimes he uses the phrase the nation, through the ratifiers, through those state ratifying conventions, and to insist on a fixed meaning given to it by whom? By the people, by we the people who ratified it, who gave it life and validity. But there is still room for legitimate change. It's not, well, I mentioned Justice Scalia liked to say it was a dead Constitution, but he understood that there's plenty of room for change, but that change has to come through the amendment process. That's what the framers built in to that Constitution, through the amendment process. And why the amendment process rather than just a change of meaning in the words of the text given to it, say, by a court? Because the amendment process itself is bottomed on popular sovereignty, on you and me, right? The states, 2/3 of the states, or 3/4 rather, have to ratify an amendment. So it's ultimately, even the amendment of the Constitution is ultimately an exercise of popular sovereignty. We, the people, speaking to our Constitution. In this respect, incidentally, Justice Scalia was thoroughly Madisonian. He always used to ask, when he was confronting a non-originalist pronouncement of a new right, for example, or new interpretation, he would say, "When did the American people vote for X?" He would say, "When did the American people vote that the death penalty is unconstitutional? They didn't. The court made it up." He said, and he used to say, "Look, if you want to change the laws, you're perfectly free to do it, but do it the way every law ought to be written, right? Do it by convincing the legislature. Don't do it by changing the meaning of the text of the Constitution." So that fixed meaning is the meaning understood by the American people when they gave life and validity to the Constitution by ratifying it through the state conventions, and it can be discovered. It can be discovered in the ratification debates and other contemporary writings, as Madison himself said. But any meaning for Madison, any meaning other than the original meaning, as he wrote in a letter to John G. Jackson in 1821, is, quote, "false, unfair, and illegitimate." So again, and in conclusion, Madison actually believed in a kind of living constitution, but not, as Justice Scalia liked to point out, one living in the way that contemporary Americans or Britons, our cousins across the water, want their constitution to be living. That is, subject to kind of fiat change by the legislature, say by the parliament in Britain's case, or even less by construction by the judiciary. Thank you. 5 minutes?